Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. It begins with a question that has no answer. A pope elected sometime in the 9th century, a papacy that lasted 2 years, a death on the streets of Rome abrupt, public, and surrounded by silence. The pope's name vanishes from the official Vatican records. The stories diverge. The dates don't align, but the rumor endures. They say there was once a female pope, say. She ruled undetected under the name Johannes Anglicus John, the Englishman, They say she gave sermons, issued edicts, even led processions. They say she died giving birth during a public ceremony and that the church covered it up. They say many things, but did it happen? To approach this question, you must enter the medieval world, not through stained glass or battles, but through ink, through manuscript margins, through the careful silence of scribes, through the mundane records of who sat where, when, and for how long. That's where the story of Pope Joan begins, not in glory, but in confusion. The earliest mention of a female pope appears not in Vatican archives, but in the Chronicon Pontificum, et Imperatorum, a chronicle written around 1250 by a Dominican friar named Jean de Mailly. Tucked between entries about real popes, he notes an unnamed woman who became pope by pretending to be a man. She was discovered only after giving birth during a procession. He offers no sources, no name, just the event. Others followed. Martin of Opavaso, known as Martinus Bellonus, spanned the tale. He gave her a name, Johannes Anglicus, said to be of English birth, educated in Athens, came and raised in Rome. He claimed she reigned for 2 years, 7 months, and 4 days. Then came the fateful procession, the crowd, the labor pains, the death. The church, he says, erased her name, out of shame. But it was too late. The story had taken root by the 14th century. Guidebooks for pilgrims in Rome were pointing out a narrow alley between the Colosseum and the Lateran Basilica as the spot where she died. Statue was even said to have stood there Papessa Giovanna, the Lady Pope, until it was removed in later centuries. But step back, strip away the color. Look at the details. The papal records from the 9th century, such as the Liber Pontificalis list, no gap where Joan might fit. Between Pope Leo IV, who died in 855, and Pope Benedict III, there is no missing space, no John unaccounted for. The sequence is clean, or so it appears. Yet the 9th century was a deeply unstable time. Papal elections were chaotic, sometimes violent. Political interference from the Holy Roman Empire was frequent. Several popes were installed and removed with little explanation. In some cases, elections were disputed by factions in Rome. Records were poorly kept or rewritten. The line between legitimate and illegitimate pope could blur, and into that blur slips a story, whether invented, remembered, or reshaped. But how could such a deception have occurred? For that, we must turn from the popes to the monasteries, to the medieval classroom. Because in the Middle Ages, education was power, and education, especially in Latin and theology, was rare, even more so for women. Yet there were exceptions. Convents, especially in Anglo-Saxon England and parts of the Carolingian Empire, were centers of learning. Women like Hatzvita of Gandersheim and Hildegard of Bingen composed plays, wrote treatises on medicine, philosophy, cosmology. Some abbesses ran scriptoria, others advised kings. A brilliant, ambitious girl, if disguised, could have been trained, especially if she had help. a father who taught her, a monastery that accepted her in disguise, companion who helped maintain the secret. It was possible, rare, but not unimaginable. And this is where the story of Pope Joan often turns not toward proof, but toward plausibility, because whether she existed or not, the idea of her fave, a woman rising undetected in a world of robes and rituals, exposes the vulnerability of a male-dominated system. It suggests that competence, not gender, determined leadership. That once in place, she performed the duties as well as any man, and that, perhaps, was the real threat. Let's pause here. Imagine a procession through the streets of 9th century Rome. The Pope, carried on a litter, flanked by bishops, followed by acolytes. The crowd chants. The incense rises. The banners flutter, but the Pope shifts awkwardly. A contraction hits. No one understands. Then comes the scream. The litter stops. Confusion. Horror. The robe is lifted, and history begins to collapse. If this story were true, the event would have been a scandal of seismic proportions. Not just for the deception, but for what it revealed. That the church could be fooled. That gender could be hidden. That a woman could perform the holiest of duties and be believed. And that people, until that moment, had not noticed. So, whether Pope Joan was real or legend, the story reveals more about the fears of the institutions than the truth of the event. That's why the story endured, because it raised a question that could not be comfortably answered. What if she had done it well? What if she had been beloved? What if she had only been punished because she was found out? And so, the records stayed silent. The Liber Pontificalist omitted her. Later, scholars dismissed her as a medieval fable. The Vatican declared the story heretical fiction. But for centuries, in towns, in taverns, in sermons, in songs, the story lived on, not because it was proven, but because it mattered. It reflected a crack in the armor of certainty. It whispered that power could wear any face, speak in any voice, sit on any throne, even a woman's dot. So we are left with two possibilities. She never existed, or she was erased. And if a pope could be erased, what else might have vanished into the silence? The story of Pope Joan is often dismissed with a single line in modern texts, a medieval legend, debunked. But that explanation arrives too quickly and forgets that history, like architecture, is held together not only by stone, but by mortar, by the gaps, the silences, the spaces that allowed things to stand. And Pope Joan's story lives in those gaps. In the 9th century, Rome was not the structured, monumental capital that tourists see today. It was a city of dust and fragments, walls crumbling from the weight of centuries, statues broken, temples reused as churches, streets narrowed by centuries of makeshift repairs and civic neglect. The grandeur of the Roman Empire had long since faded, but its skeleton remained, picked over and patched by each new regime. Papal power existed here, not in marble, but in maneuvering and maneuvering. In such a place was everything. The church at that time was not the global, centralized institution we imagine today. In the 800s, the papacy was a role contested by noble families, foreign kings, and the Roman mob. The Pope was both a bishop and a kind of local warlord, issuing decrees by day and surviving assassination plots by night. It was not uncommon for a new pope to be installed, deposed, and replaced within months. At least a dozen papal elections in this period involved open violence. Into that noise steps the silence of the Pope Joan story, because, if ever there was a time when a figure could be inserted or removed from papal history, it was here. The supposed date of Joan's reign, according to later chroniclers like Martinus Polonus, fell between Pope Leo IV, died in July 855, and Pope Benedict III, elected in September 855. though not consecrated until later. There was, indeed, a moment of uncertainty here. Some sources suggest that another man, Anastasius, tried to claim the papacy during this gap. Others argue that the process of electing Benedict was interrupted, perhaps by factions or foreign interference. Could Joan's brief rule have occurred in this narrow window? It's tempting to say no, because modern papal lists are precise, continuous, and seemingly reliable. But these lists were compiled retrospectively. The earliest surviving versions of the Liber Pontifical List, the book of papal biographies, are inconsistent. Some entries are missing. Others are vague, tainted. The documents were not maintained in real time by neutral historians, but by church scribes with specific purposes to establish lineage, assert legitimacy, and reinforce order. If something or someone disrupted that order, it could be left out or rewritten. And rewriting was easier than we imagine before the printing press. History was fragile. It lived in ink and parchment and copies made by hand. A mistake or a lie could be repeated so often that it became fact. Conversely, an uncomfortable truth could be allowed to fade. Scribes could skip a name. Editors could omit a sentence. A bishop in the right place at the right time could declare a record apocryphal. So if there had been a Pope Joan, and if her reign had lasted only a short time, 2 years, perhaps sand ended in scandal, then her erasure would not have required a grand conspiracy, only quiet decisions, gentle omissions, the reshuffling of a few dates, the folding of one reign into another, and over time, the gaps would close, the silence would settle, and the name would vanish, but not entirely, because in monasteries and schools, among those who copied not only scripture but rumor, her story took root. Jean de Mailly, Martinus Polonus, and later chroniclers like Stephen of Bourbon all record variations of her tale. Some offer details: her disguise, her education, her lover. Others focus on her death, always in public, always during a procession, always marking her body as the source of scandal. But none of them offer a source. This has long been used as a reason to dismiss the story. But in the Middle Ages, sourcing was rare. Chroniclers often recorded oral traditions, local legends, or things heard from other monks. Accuracy was less important than moral clarity, and in Joan's case, the moral was clear. Pride goes before a fall. Deceit is punished. God's order cannot be mocked. She became a cautionary tale. And yet, tone of the stories often wavers. Some chroniclers write with scorn, others with pity. Few, like Martinus Polonus, seem conflicted, recording the tale without fully condemning her. His chronicle includes the phrase, "She is said to have been Pope," suggesting both distance and reluctance. This ambiguity mattered because, as the story spread, it began to appear in unexpected places. By the 14th century, there were statues, not in the Vatican, but in Roman neighborhoods. One such statue, perhaps originally a pagan goddess, was nicknamed Papessa Giovanna. Pilgrims were told it marked the place where she died. Some scholars argue this was a misunderstanding. The statue was never meant to represent her. But even so, the meaning had shifted. People believed. They looked at the stone and saw a story the church wouldn't tell. And stories, especially forbidden ones, have power. There's a strange footnote to all of this. From the 13th century onward, popes were seated on a special chair during their enthronement, a marble seat with a peculiar opening beneath. Some historians claim that this sedia stercoraria was used to confirm the pope's gender, that a deacon would reach beneath and declare duos habet et bene pendentes, he has to, and they hang well, a crude rite, supposedly added after Joan to prevent another such deception. Modern scholars dismiss this as legend, but the fact that it was believed at all, that pilgrims spoke of it, guidebooks described it, reveals something deeper, that Pope Joan had become more than a person. She was now a fear, a symbol, a threat, not just of gender, but of disruption. She disrupted the idea that authority was visible, that truth could be verified by robes and titles, that power was inherently male. And the church responded not with direct denial, but with discomfort. Even the Protestant reformers, centuries later, seized on her story as proof of Catholic corruption. For Martin Luther and his followers, Joan was not a warning about women, but a condemnation of the papacy, a symbol of deception at the heart of Rome. In response, Catholic scholars worked hard to discredit the story. By the 17th century, the Church had declared the entire tale false. The Vatican removed references. Modern editions of the Liber Pontificalis make no mention. Joan is not on the official papal lists, but she remains in memory, not because she was proven, but because she was possible, and possibility is dangerous. Let's pause again. Imagine a monk in a quiet scriptorium, copying a manuscript. He reaches the section where Pope Joan is mentioned. The abbot has warned him not to include it. It is heresy, the abbot says. It dishonors the church. But the monk hesitates. He remembers the story his teacher told. He remembers the whispers from Rome. He remembers the statue. He writes it anyway. One line out enough. That single quote is all it takes. A legend slips between the lines of history and survives, because some gaps were never meant to be filled. Some stories were meant to linger, even when they make the powerful uncomfortable, even when the names are erased. What is it we fear when we fear that she might have been real? And what does it mean that the church worked so hard to forget her? If history were a stone wall, Pope Joan would be the hairline crack running straight through it, thin enough to ignore, deep enough to shift everything if pressed. She exists in that liminal space between presence and absence. Her story, too detailed to dismiss entirely, yet too disruptive to ever be comfortably included in official memory. And so, as the centuries turned and the church grew more powerful, more codified, more global, the legend of the female pope didn't fade. It embedded itself in the question no one could quite silence. What does it mean when erasure leaves a trace? We must consider this not as a question of scandal, but as one of infrastructure, how belief is managed, recorded, and protected. The Catholic Church has long been a master of continuity. It has survived wars, plagues, schisms, empires rising and falling. Its greatest tool has not always been scripture or doctrine, but history, carefully kept, carefully arranged, and when necessary, carefully corrected by the time the Renaissance arrived. With its appetite for rediscovery and documentation, the church found itself needing to answer not just questions of faith, but of fact. Humanist scholars, now fluent in Latin, began re-examining the dusty texts of the Middle Ages. They looked at the gaps in the papal succession. They noted the inconsistencies. They raised their eyebrows at the sudden appearance and disappearance of 1 John in certain 13th and 14th century sources. Some were curious, some were skeptical, and some, like David Blondel, a 17th century Calvinist historian, took up the task of debunking the story outright. Blondel argued convincingly that Pope Joan was a fabricational allegory mistaken for reality. He traced the evolution of the story, showing how it had grown more elaborate with time. He argued that no contemporary 9th century sources mention her, that the timeline didn't fit, that the entire tale was a medieval cautionary tale turned rumor turned forgery. His work was persuasive. The Vatican welcomed it. Catholic scholars could now point to a well-argued refutation from a Protestant, no less a delicious irony. But in attempting to erase Pope Joan definitively, they also preserved her in a different way. They gave her an enemy. They gave her a bibliography. And they ensured that future historians, centuries later, would still be asking why so much effort had been spent disproving someone who never existed. because it's not just the presence of the story that matters, it's the nervousness it causes. Let's return again to that dusty, uncertain 9th century. Picture the street where Joan is said to have died. Later, medieval texts identify it as a narrow lane connecting the Colosseum and the Lateran Palace, one of the most sacred routes in Rome. According to these sources, the Pope was traveling in full procession when labor pains began. The birth, they say, was not hidden, but witnessed messy, public, undeniable. We have no contemporary record of such an event, but we do have signs that something changed after the 10th century. Papal processions reportedly began avoiding that stretch of road. Some texts refer to the lane with ominous nicknames: Vicus Papici, the street of the female pope. For a time, a shrine or marker supposedly stood there, though it too disappeared. Could a single woman's downfall have led to a real, structural change in ceremonial practice? Was this reverse engineering later writers creating meaning from the movement of processions? We may never know. The evidence is too tangled, the records too distant, but the tension remains, and that tension tells you us something important, not about whether Joan existed, but about how the church handled the possibility that she might have, because possibility is powerful. Let's look at the tools of erasure. When institutions want to erase, they don't shout, they whisper, they reclassify, they declare apocrypha, they stop copying certain texts, they instruct libraries to remove materials for preservation that are never returned, they redirect attention. This doesn't require burning books or imprisoning heretics. It requires patience, bureaucracy, boredom, and, for the most part, it works, but not completely. Because while erasure can eliminate names, it often preserves outlines. The shape of what once was remains. Think of it like a painting removed from a wall. The artwork may be gone, but the dust pattern lingers the frame's absence, leaving a brighter rectangle in the gloom. Pope Joan is that rectangle. Even today, she appears in odd places, in 15th century playing cards. There's a pape's figure depicted in robes, holding a book, wearing a triple crown. She appears in early tarot decks too, seated like a pope, sometimes flanked by acolytes. Historians debate whether she's meant to represent Joan or some symbolic wisdom figure, but the imagery is too pointed to ignore. The papessa sits in opposition to the Pope. She reminds us that authority has a twin, that legitimacy can be mirrored and questioned in literature. Joan resurfaces often. In the 19th century, novelists took up her story. She became a symbol of courage, of deception, of tragedy, sometimes heroic, sometimes pathetic, always dramatic. In modern times, she has been reclaimed in feminist texts, not because her existence is proven, quote, because her erasure is instructive. She shows how power is policed, how history is curated, and how exclusion is enforced, not just with chains, but with silence. And so we ask again, what if she had been real? Not as an accident, not as a scandal, but as a pope. What would that have meant? Would the church have changed? Would theology have adapted? Or would her existence have been folded into orthodoxy, reshaped, neutralized? Would she have become Saint Joanna, or simply a footnote? These are questions without answers, but they reveal the deeper story, because the story of Pope Joan is not about a woman deceiving the church. It's about a church unable to absorb her, unable to admit the possibility. And so she became a threat, not because of what she did, but because of what she represented. The idea that sacred structures could be altered by competence, that gender might not matter where holiness is concerned, that the truth might wear a different face than expected, even if she never lived. Her shadow did it, shaped roads. It sparked debates. It haunted processions. It drew Protestants and humanists, feminists and satirists, believers and skeptics, and in the corners of church history, the boring footnotes, the altered lists, the contradictions still lingers. That's the final legacy of Pope Joan. Not her reign, but her removal. Because history is not what's remembered, it's what's resisted, what's rewritten, what's quietly forgotten, until someone, centuries later, asks why. Why does this name not appear? Why is this chapter missing? Why is there a gap where there should be a pope? And what does it mean that even now we're still unsure? Can erasure ever truly erase? Or does it merely delay the return of the question? The ancient libraries of Europe are not silent. Even when the reading rooms are still, the shelves murmur. You feel it most when leafing through a manuscript no one has touched in decades. The paper is stiff, the margins uneven, the ink browned with age. And just when you think you found a dull, predictable text in old homily, a bishop's account ledger, a copied psalm, you come across a name that shouldn't be there, or a pronoun that flickers oddly, or a confession that seems too careful. 100 years ago, scholars dismissed these oddities as scribal errors. Today, we know better. In this quiet first story, we travel to a cold stone cell in northern France in the early 12th century, far from the grand basilicas of Rome, far from papal councils or imperial courts. We are inside the modest confines of a small Benedictine monastery, known today only through scattered records, a few charters, cane-copied calendar, and one surviving page of correspondence that historians nearly threw out. This single piece of vellum creased, water-damaged, barely legible names, a monk, whose life would eventually be forgotten entirely if not for a footnote in the 1920s. The monk's name was Brother Eugenius. He was described in the monastery's register as a quiet man, good at herbal medicine, and entrusted with managing the drying of meats and root vegetables in the early spring. His script was careful and small, his Latin passable. There are 2 short sermons attributed to him, plain, moralistic, uninspired. And yet, something odd appears when you examine the register's later entries. By the time of Eugenius's death in 1123, the scribe no longer refers to him as Frater brother, but as sore or sister. Not once, but 3 times. Historians assumed this was a mistake, except it wasn't just a one-off slip. It appeared again in the monastery's death log, and once more in a marginal note on a letter sent from a neighboring abbey. Sore Eugenius, formerly known as Frater Eugenius. The change was abrupt. It wasn't accompanied by scandal or excommunication. There was no record of a trial or confession. The abbey simply adjusted the title quietly, bureaucratically, without explanation. What could this mean? This mystery wasn't investigated seriously until 1971, when a historian of medieval gender named Brigitte Deschamps published a short essay titled The Disappearance of Brother Eugenius. Her thesis was simple. Eugenius was likely a woman who had entered the monastery in disguise. To modern ears, that may sound dramatic, but in medieval Europe, it was not as rare as we imagine. The church, despite its strict gender roles, relied heavily on people of all skill levels and backgrounds. Small monastic communities were often desperate for educated novices, especially those with even basic literacy. A child who had been taught to read and write, especially in Latin, was a valuable asset. Women were almost never given this education, unless they came from noble households or convent schools. But if a woman had somehow learned, perhaps tutored by a priest, or a father who taught all his children equally, she had only 2 choices: a nunnery or the world disguised. For some, the choice was easy. Nunneries were few, often overcrowded, and far less influential than male monasteries. They were sometimes run under the authority of a male abbot, even when the women themselves did all the work. Their access to books, education, and authority was limited. A woman of letters might have found the walls of a convent confining in a way that even prayer couldn't soften. So she entered the male world instead. She bound her chest. She cut her hair. She changed her name to something gender-neutral, Eugenius. Julian, Claude, hilarious. And she walked into the cloister. She would have spoken softly, avoided bathing with others, accepted the cold willingly, read aloud when asked, prayed at every hour, and waited perhaps hoping no one would notice, or perhaps believing that God already knew and had no quarrel with it. That is the quiet radicalism of these hidden women. They did not rebel loudly. They did not write manifestos. They simply lived inside a structure that claimed to forbid them, waited for time to catch up. Take the case of Marinos of Alexandria, a monk from the 6th century. The story appears in various hagiographies, usually under the title The Life of Saint Marinos. According to legend, Marinos was the daughter of a wealthy Christian merchant who, after her mother died, asked to follow her father into monastic life. Rather than reject her, he dressed her as a man and brought her into the monastery. There, she lived her entire life as a monk, never discovered, never expelled, eventually canonized. The story would be dismissed as myth were it not for the pattern. Across Eastern Orthodox and Western Christian traditions, from Ireland to Syria, tales appear of women entering monastic communities, disguised as men, some caught, others not, some forgiven, some punished, and some, curiously, simply accepted. Historians are divided on how common this was. Some argue it was rare, exaggerated by medieval moralists as cautionary tales. Others believe it was more widespread, especially in isolated monasteries where records were patchy and newcomers seldom questioned. But the records that do survive suggest a strange mixture of attitudes. There is no clear, acute church doctrine from the early medieval period that explicitly forbids a woman from entering a male monastery if she is unknowingly accepted. Punishments, when they appear, are inconsistently applied. In some regions, the woman is cast out. In others, she is permitted to stay, especially for work is deemed valuable. This ambiguity is key because it means that even within one of the most rigid institutions in history, there were cracks, small spaces where human decisions overrode policy, where a scribe could choose not to report, where a prior might offer quiet protection, or a fellow monk might say nothing because the work was done well and the prayers were said. And the rules, though bent, still pointed toward God. In that quiet defiance lies a deeper story, not just of gender, but of silence, of how institutions are navigated by those who are supposed to be excluded, of how history absorbs them, sometimes kindly, sometimes not, of how the church's archives thought to be solid, exhaustive, permanent are, full of pages where names blur, identities shift, and rules falter. Even today, digital scans of old registries reveal inconsistencies. At the monastery of San Cugat in Spain, a novice listed in 1191 as Brother Juan is later corrected centuries later by a marginal note reading this was probably Sor Juana. At an abbey near Cologne, records show a monk who oversaw the wine cellar for 20 years. In his obituary, the Latin word for brother is crossed out and replaced with sister. No explanation. These aren't stories of rebellion. These are stories of survival. And that, perhaps, is the most remarkable part. Because to live an entire life beneath an assumed name, constant prayer, without fame or recognition, only to die with your secret barely noticed, that is not an act of ambition. It is an act of endurance, a quiet offering, a life given to God, not through the doorway provided, but through a crack in the wall. Which brings us back to Brother Eugenius. We'll never know her real name. We don't have a birth record, or a family tree, or even a solid guess. We have only those 3 lines in a monastery's death log and a few pages of unremarkable writing. But perhaps that is enough, because in the slow, sleep-inducing rhythm of history, where popes and kings make noise, but the world is built by anonymous hands, it is the hidden ones who show us the structure. She peeled vegetables. She stirred vinegar into poultices. She walked a cloister in silence. She erased herself. so she could remain. And in doing so, she reminds us that the church, like all institutions, is shaped as much by those it forgets as by those it remembers. What other names were left off the parchment? What other lives were written in the margins? And what truths do we lose not from lies but from careful, quiet edits? If you spend enough time with medieval church records, a peculiar truth begins to surface. It's not always what's written that matters. It's what's quietly adjusted. Scratched out titles, smudged pronouns, redundant footnotes, a scribbled line in the margin. These are the quiet edits of human decision, small enough to escape attention, yet deliberate enough to leave questions lingering across centuries. And when it comes to women who lived as men within monastic life, cadets tell their own story. To understand the scope of this phenomenon, we must pause here in the dim, stone-chilled scriptoriums of the 10th and 11th centuries. Among the parchment and the prayers, the quills, and the candlelight, Europe, at this time, was slowly rebuilding itself after centuries of Viking raids and internal disorder. Monasteries were some of the only stable institutions in entire regions. They preserved language, land ownership, and knowledge. They ran hospitals. They fed the poor. And most importantly, they kept records. But even the church, in all its administrative zeal, was not immune to contradiction. For every rule it wrote, another was broken. And so it was with the Regula Benedicti, the rule of Saint Benedict, the foundational text for Western monasticism, written in the 6th century. It dictated everything from how monks should pray to how they should sleep, dress, eat, and interact with the outside world. It was precise, but not perfect. Saint Benedict made no allowance for women in male monasteries, naturally, as it would have been considered unthinkable. But that didn't prevent it from happening, and when it did happen, as it certainly did, no new rule was created to prevent it. Instead, abbots, scribes, and priests worked around the edges of the text, creating local policies, discreet arrangements, and, in some cases, deliberate silences. There's one example from an Italian abbey in the Apennines, where a monk named Petrus was discovered upon death to have been biologically female. The burial record from 1237 is unusually candid, noting simply, Brother Petrus, long in service, was buried with the rites of the monastic order. It was then discovered that the Lord's design had placed him in a form not his own. No punishment, no scandal, just acceptance. The abbot's own commentary in the same manuscript adds, what matters more to God, the appearance or the devotion? This was not a progressive statement, it was a practical one. Petrus had spent decades in the abbey, tending sheep, brewing beer, copying texts, and serving mass, whatever the legal doctrine said. The lived reality was that his labor and his discipline had kept the monastery functioning, so the rules bent, and, not for the first time, in another case, covered in a late 14th century manuscript, now housed in the Bodleian Library at Oxford. A monk named Julianus was the head of the monastery gardens for over 20 years. He wrote several treatises on medicinal herbs, some of which survive today and were even cited by later Renaissance physicians. But a marginal note in one copy of his herbarium reads, in truth, Willinies was born Juliana, though none knew until her death. What's more interesting is that the writer of the note makes no moral judgment. Instead, he remarks, it is strange that she kept the beard so well. Whether this was literal or metaphorical is unclear. Many monastics shaved regularly, but the comment suggests that Julianus was not a recent arrival, nor an accidental member. He was fully embedded in monastic life, enough that his gender never came into question. And this, perhaps, is what made the difference. It was not rebellion that let these individuals pass. It was usefulness, steadiness, a capacity to vanish into routine, to pray without drawing notice, to work with quiet diligence, to be boring. Monastic life, after all, did not reward charisma. It rewarded silence, regularity, repetition, and for someone trying to live in disguise, those qualities were ideal. That's why these stories so rarely end in drama. They taper off, instead, into quiet burials, gentle corrections. New names crashed over the old. Even those caught in life were sometimes forgiven in death. In one German monastery in the early 1300s, a woman disguised as a man was discovered after falling ill. Her fellow monks reportedly debated what to do. The abbot decided not to expel her. Instead, he gave her a private room, continued to call her by her chosen name, and instructed the monastery scribe to record her in the registry as a devoted servant of Christ, whose form was not what it seemed. She died 10 years later, a respected member of the community. We can't know how many similar stories never made it to parchment, but the fact that so many exist across different centuries, countries, and monastic orders suggests something greater than coincidence. It suggests a pattern, and within that pattern lies a deep tension between doctrine and daily life. Because while the church taught that gender was divinely assigned and strictly divided, the reality within its walls was more fluid. A monastery might be remote, short-staffed, or struggling. A literate novice, even in disguise, might be seen as a godsend in some cases. Abbots may have suspected, but turned a blind eye in others. Monks may have known, but said nothing. Sometimes, silence is not ignorance, it's accommodation. And sometimes, a veil is not just a symbol of modesty. It is a strategy, it's a shield. It's important to remember that many of these women didn't cross into monasteries seeking power. They sought peace, education, safety. In an era where marriage could be a death sentence, where childbirth was often fatal, and where women's voices were confined to narrow spaces, the monastery offered a rare escape. Not perfect, of course, but structured, predictable, holy. And if the price of admission was a new name and a new wardrobe, many were willing to pay it. They became invisible in order to be seen. Which brings us to one of the most curious elements of all: how the church, over time, responded, not by creating harsh new prohibitions, but by quietly absorbing the ambiguity. There was never a formal, papal decree condemning women disguising themselves as monks. No canon law created to punish it retroactively. Instead, the church turned its attention elsewhere, in the archives. They preserved the edits. One historian compared these edited names to palimpsest parchment that had been scraped clean and reused, with traces of the original text still visible beneath. That's what these lives were: palimpsest, layers of identity, layers of devotion, layers of bureaucracy, and beneath them all, the soft imprint of a woman's life written beneath a man's name, not to deceive, but to belong, to pray without interruption, to labor without condescension, to exist in a system that said she couldn't and still did. So when we read the record of Brother Eugenius, or Petrus, or Julianus, or the nameless herbalist in a lost French abbey, we are not just reading individual stories. We are reading the limits of the rules, the gaps between intention and reality, the slivers of human mercy within institutional rigidity. These monks, who were also women, were not revolutionaries. They didn't seek to destroy the church from within. They weren't plotting equality. They weren't demanding recognition. They just wanted a life of order, and they found it in the one place they weren't supposed to. What does that tell us about the past? About how history treats the invisible, and about how many stories we've lost, not because they were never told, but because they were told too quietly to be heard. What lingers in memory is not always what was loudest at the time. In the history of the church, there were councils, wars, schisms, inquisitions, and declarations, loud things. But between them, beneath them, alongside them, were monks tending, sheep, cleaning latrines, copying psalms, boiling herbs, and among them, knowingly or quietly known women. They didn't speak up. They didn't ask to be remembered. And yet, here we are, remembering them. Not through biographies or epics, but through funeral registers, faded ink, and patterns that only emerge after centuries. In this final section of the story, we leave the abbeys of Europe and follow a quieter ripple of the same phenomenon, how the very structure of medieval archives may have been shaped in part by people who were never meant to be part of the system at all. Let's return briefly to the early 1100s. A Benedictine monastery near Tours kept a detailed record of its kitchen inventories. First glance, it's exactly what you'd expect. Onions, dried peas, garlic, vinegar, eel, mutton, some wine, some herbs. But among the quarterly ledgers, written by different hands over time, you'll find a shift. Starting in the year 1127, one of the scribes begins to use a more delicate Latin hand, curving letters, generous spacing, fewer abbreviations. A codicologist analyzing these pages in 2004 noticed a consistency in the way this particular scribe formed the letter A, a small, closed loop that was statistically more common in manuscripts copied by women. It's a minor point. Speculative, even handwriting analysis can't confirm gender, but the same scribe appears again later. In a marginal note written beside a theological poem, this section copied for Brother N. There is no brother in the monastery records, but a burial note from 1140 mentions the passing of one long among us, whose name we do not repeat, but whose devotion was known to God alone. Scholars now believe this was likely a woman who had spent over a decade inside the monastery as a copyist, known only by initial, honored in death, erased in name. We'll never know what she believed, whether she lived in fear of discovery, whether anyone in the cloister knew her secret and kept it. What we do know is that she wrote, and that her handwriting, boring and beautiful, changed the look of a dozen books that will go on to be copied again. There is a monastery in southern Poland, near Krakow, where a nearly identical pattern emerges. A monk named Laurentus is recorded in abbey logs for 30 years as keeper of alms and guardian of the novices. His Latin was clean, his sermons short. Copia, in a 15th century recopying of a funeral sermon, a different monk notes. Laurentius was of gentle speech, of slight build, and was known to wear two tunics. Two tunics was a phrase sometimes used cryptically to describe women in disguise, a nod to layered clothing as a way to hide feminine features. The phrasing was careful. There was no accusation, only description. It ends, he is buried with honor, as all who serve faithfully, and then nothing more. Why were these figures not condemned? Why weren't they cast out? One reason may lie in how the church viewed gender in relation to sin and salvation. Medieval theology emphasized intention. A person's salvation depended not only on actions, but on their heart, whether they sinned knowingly, maliciously, selfishly. If a woman had taken on the identity of a man for personal gain or to corrupt others, she would have been condemned. But if she did so in the pursuit of holiness, to live a devout life otherwise denied her, some clerics believed the act could be forgiven, even accepted. It's a subtle distinction, but medieval minds were used to navigating fine lines. The difference between heresy and orthodoxy could rest on the use of a single word. Between excommunication and sanctity, there might be only silence. That silence was often a gift. For example, in the Ancrene Wis, a 13th century guide for female anchoresses, the author speaks of the virtue of disappearing, of removing oneself from the world so thoroughly that even memory lets go. For women who entered the church disguised as men, the act of vanishing was not symbolic. It was practical. It was how they survived, and perhaps how they hoped to be judged. You begin to see that the church was not one monolithic thing. It was 100,000 hands, copying scrolls in cold stone rooms, each with their own sense of justice, each weighing silence against duty. A bishop might condemn, but a scribe might protect, an abbot might quietly approve, and the grave, in the end, recorded only what was convenient. There's a compelling example of this in the curious case of John the Mason, a woman known from building records in England during the early 14th century. Her name appears on ledgers for the construction of a church choir screen, unusual, as women were rarely named in such roles. But then her name disappears. A decade later, a brother John appears in the same records, with identical handwriting, same style of measurements, same abbreviated Latin. Later still, in a church inventory, an anonymous note reads, "This vault designed by our beloved brother, whose plans were preserved in the cedar chest, though we do not say the name, preserved but unnamed, revered but erased." The uncomfortable truth is that much of what survives from medieval history was never meant to be examined like this. Medieval scribes didn't write for us. They wrote for their peers, their abbots, their fellow monks. When they changed a name or corrected a title, they weren't hiding something from history. They were smoothing over a complication, making the present more manageable. But those edits bade they remain, and the edits tell stories, perhaps, more than the originals ever could. What does this mean for our understanding of medieval gender or medieval spirituality? It tells us that both were more porous than we were taught, that identity was not always declared or policed, that the monastery was not only a place of rigid order, but also a place where quiet anomalies could persist, so long as they were useful, humble, devout. These hidden figures didn't change doctrine. They didn't challenge papal authority, but they changed something else, the texture of history, by existing within the church. They forced it to accommodate them even slightly by praying in silence. They altered the definition of who could be holy, and by being forgotten, they've become unforgettable. So what are we left with? Half names, initials, scribbled margins, scratch-outs. We don't get closure. You don't get a complete story. But maybe we get something better. A sense that beneath the page, behind the ink, beneath centuries of official history, there is another layer. One of quiet defiance, quiet devotion. A layer built by people who were never supposed to be part of the system, and yet became its keepers, because someone had to copy the Psalms. Someone had to measure the walls. Someone had to light the morning candles, and sometimes that someone wore 2 T-U-N-I-C-S. So next time you hear that women were excluded from church history, can agree and disagree. They were excluded from titles, from councils, from the gilded names in stained glass, but not from the dust, not from the pages, not from the quiet rhythm of prayer, and not from the shape of the church itself. What else lies just beneath the parchment? What more have we missed? Not because it was hidden, but because we weren't looking closely enough. It's easy to forget that in the medieval world, the voice itself was a kind of power. Tia, not just what was said, but who was allowed to say it, and when, and in what space. Public speech was a privilege, public prayer even more so. And while the cathedral choristers chanted in Latin, and the priests held the liturgy in stone chambers, there were other prayers mumbled in kitchens, behind doors, in childbirth beds, and sometimes, in the open. These prayers belonged to women, but not to all women. Only some dared speak them aloud. This is the story of one of them. Her name was not Joan of Arc or Hildegard or any other sainted woman whose visions were recorded in Latin by admiring monks. Her name was Marjorie Clay, and she was not a mystic or a scholar or a noblewoman with time for correspondence. She was a midwife from the year 1326 until 1341. Her name appeared in the municipal records of Norwich, England, a total of 37 times. Sometimes she was fined for unlicensed healing. Other times she was paid by the city for her work delivering infants in difficult labor. Once, she was summoned to testify in a domestic dispute, likely because of her role in the community as both healer and confidant. But in one particular set of records from 1340, Marjorie's name appears with a different accusation entirely for the utterance of sacred words not sanctioned by the church. That phrase seems vague, but in the margin of the parchment, in a different hand, someone clarified, she speaks the prayers over the children and sometimes aloud over the mothers. In other words, Marjorie had been heard speaking religious blessings aloud, not in Latin, not inside a church, not from an ordained cleric, but in Middle English, in kitchens and birthing chambers. The problem was not the content, it was the voice. You see, medieval theology placed strict limits on who could speak sacred words. The act of blessing, of invoking divine protection, was reserved for priests. Even monks needed permission to offer certain prayers over the sick or dying, and women could pray silently. They could sing in convents, but to speak a blessing aloud, especially in public, was seen as presumptuous. And yet, midwives had done it for centuries, because childbirth was not something that waited for official permission. It came when it came. And when it came, there was blood and pain, and sometimes death. In those moments, many women turned to the midwife, not only for physical help, but for spiritual assurance. Marjorie's words were simple, according to the court report. Christ, keep thee, little one, from sorrow. Enter into this world with grace. May your first cry be heard by angels. There was no heresy in this, no denial of church teaching. The fact that it was spoken aloud by a woman over a newborn, that was enough. The bishop's court ordered her to cease. She was not jailed, not excommunicated, but warned. Yet, Marjorie continued. The next year, a priest named Walter Blanche, whose parish included the eastern edge of Norwich, wrote to the bishop's vicar saying, "The woman Clay persists. I have heard the prayers myself. They are not profane, but they are not authorized. She speaks as though ordained." This accusation, as though ordained, would become the central argument against Marjorie, that she was assuming the role of a priest without the sacrament, that her voice, even in compassion, was a form of rebellion. We don't know what Marjorie thought of this. She left no letters, no confessions, no theology, but we do know that she was summoned again in 1341. This time, court proceedings lasted 3 days. The record is detailed, unusually so. It includes the testimony of 5 women, all of them from Norwich, all of them mothers who had been attended by Marjorie. One of them, a woman named Aline, said, "She saved my daughter and me both. She pressed her hands to my belly and said words that made my heart still. I do not know Latin, but I know she spoke of Christ." Another said, "She told my son he was watched by God, even as she rubbed salt on his lips." She sang to a low tune, like a hymn, but not. These testimonies were heartfelt, but not persuasive to the court. Compassion was not doctrine. Healing was not liturgy. The bishop's vicar declared, "Let her hands continue in their craft, but let her mouth be silent." It is at this point that Marjorie disappears from the records. Was she imprisoned? No. Was she exiled? Likely. Most historians believe she simply stopped speaking the words aloud, or perhaps stopped speaking them where anyone with authority might. Here, the birth rooms of medieval England were not public spaces. They were enclosed, female-dominated, unsupervised. What happened inside them often stayed there, so it is entirely possible, even likely, that Marjorie continued to pray. Whispers, in fragments, in songs that were not called songs, in words that sounded like lullabies but meant more. This quiet resistance, this subtle defiance, was not unique to Marjorie. Across Europe, midwives were among the only women who whose work touched both the spiritual and the physical worlds. They were present at the boundary of life and death. They knew when to press herbs against a woman's thigh and when to pray aloud. They were trusted in moments when no priest was present. They knew suffering intimately and did not wait for permission to speak comfort. That's why church authorities were wary, not because the midwives were heretical, but because they were necessary. And necessity is hard to control in southern France. A woman named Jezebel was condemned in 1373 for performing the sign of the crossover, an infant with unblessed oil. The oil had been pressed from olives she grew herself. She had no relic or credential, and yet, when the mother died in labor, the baby lived. Her punishment: confession in silence. In the German town of Uma, a midwife named Greta was ordered in 1411 to cease chanting psalms in the vernacular during labor. She obeyed publicly. But a century later, a local priest wrote in a parish note that Greta's daughter now does the same, though she calls it humming. Over and over, the pattern repeats. The words are forbidden, but they persist. Why? Because in the most dangerous moments of medieval life, childbirth, pestilence, hunger, women turn to one another, and in those moments, the need for comfort, for blessing, for words that tethered suffering to meaning, outweighed the fear of breaking rules. And so, the midwife prayed, and the child breathed, and the voice of a woman filled the silence where no priest stood. Marjorie Clay was not excommunicated. She was not canonized. She was not, in any traditional sense, remembered. But the mothers she helped did remember, and it's because of their testimony, their willingness to speak her name and describe her voice, that we know she existed. At all, it raises an uncomfortable question. How many others prayed? How many were silenced? How many left no record because they were neither accused nor praised, only buried? The church had many tools for shaping belief. It had pulpits and prisons, but it could not fully erase a whispered prayer spoken in a candlelit room by a woman holding a dying infant. Nor could it stop a mother from passing keys, those words down to her daughter. The liturgies of ordinary women were never officially sanctioned, but they traveled nonetheless, by breath, by memory, by song, and they linger even now in folk rhymes and lullabies, in whispered phrases repeated at cradlesides. There are echoes of Marjorie, Cada, of Ysabel, of all the women who dared to speak sacred words aloud, knowing that no one would write them down. But what if those words mattered? What if they kept the world from collapsing, one fragile birth at a time? And what, exactly, makes a voice sacred? Is it the robe? The training? Oh, the truth spoken quietly in the dark, in the dark. In medieval Europe, childbirth was a sacred crisis, holy danger, a place where theology met blood and breath. The church taught that new life was a miracle, but also a peril. A baby might be born dead without ever being baptized. A mother might perish before absolution. And in between these mortal thresholds stood the midwife. It was her hands that turned the infant. It was her fingers that pulled the placenta down. And, far more controversially, it was sometimes her voice that spoke the blessing, the one that only priests were meant to say. We left off with Marjorie Clay, a midwife in 14th century Norwich, who was reprimanded by church authorities for speaking sacred words aloud over the newborns she helped deliver. She was not punished severely, not burned, not jailed, not banished, but she was silenced, officially, and yet her story was not unique. Throughout Europe, especially between the 12th and 15th centuries, women like Marjorie existed in a strange and unstable religious limbo. The church both needed and distrusted them. Midwives were essential to life and terrifying to theology. They operated outside the chain of sacraments. They touched the unclean, They saw what male priests never saw, and some of them dared to pray. In this section, we look not just at individual cases, but at the broader system that shaped and erased their voices. Let us begin with a strange, dry book, the Canon Episcopi, originally written in the 10th century and copied again and again for centuries after. The Canon Episcopi was a church manual, a set of rules and guidance for bishops. In one of its lesser-known sections, it warns against women who believe they can summon spirits, who invoke names not granted them, who speak words they do not understand. The language here is vague, but chilling. It groups magical acts, unauthorized blessings, and spoken Latin under one banner. Transgression, to speak as a priest, even if only in comfort, was to pretend, and to pretend, in the church's view, was to lie before God. But the reality in many villages was different. Parish priests were overworked. Some were illiterate, others lived far from their flocks. A woman in labor might be several hours' walk from a priest, or more. If the baby was born weak, or still, or in visible distress, there might not be time. So what happened? The midwife, did what she could. In some cases, she poured water over the child and murmured the baptismal formula. I baptize thee in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. According to later canon law, this was valid if done correctly and in good faith, and especially if no priest was available. But the line between emergency, baptism, and presumptuous prayer was thin, and that line was often policed not by Rome, but by local clergy, men whose decisions were shaped by personality, culture, superstition, and fear. In 1460, in the Bavarian town of Passau, midwife named Berta was brought before the bishop's tribunal. Her crime, had performed a baptism without notifying the priest. When questioned, she said, the child was blue. The breath would not come. I said the words so he would not die in sin. The priest argued that she had no authority. The bishop decided that her baptism was valid, but she was still punished. Why? Because she had used her voice too readily. That phrase, too readily, appears in other documents, too. It reflects an unspoken belief that even when women acted correctly, they should not appear too confident. In 1485, in a French court record from Poitiers, a midwife named Cecile was accused of blessing a sick woman with oil. She admitted it, but said the oil was just cooking oil, and the words were from her mother. The court dismissed the charges, but the bishop added a warning in the margin. Let not the daughters of Eve forget their place. It is not given to them to speak thus. The rules were never consistent. One bishop condemned, another forgave. But through it all, the midwives endured. Let us pause here and look more closely at what these women actually did, not what they were accused of, but what they themselves wrote in a surviving notebook from the 14th century, now kept in the archives at the University of Heidelberg. There is a collection of birthing instructions. It is written in Middle High German in a woman's hand. Most of it concerns mundane things: when to press warm water on the belly, how to listen for a heartbeat, what teas to brew for afterbirth pains. But scattered throughout are small prayers, written phonetically, rhyming. One reads, Jesu mild and Mary kind, let this babe's safe breath find. In pain and blood, let love be near, guard this life with angel's ear. There is no record of this midwife being punished. No name is attached, but the notebook was well worn, passed down, used for at least 40 years, judging by the ink. This, too, was a form of history, not the loud kind, the quiet kind made of repetition and need. Across Europe, midwives formed their own oral traditions. They taught one another how to hold the hips, how to unwrap the cord from the neck, and how to speak just softly enough to comfort the living and not provoke the dead. They also shared protective phrases. words to say when labor stalled or spirits were feared nearby. These were not official prayers, okay? They were part superstition, part scripture, part experience. In Sicily, a midwife was heard to whisper, "Michael, shield her. Gabriel, guide her. Mary, stand at her feet." Key. In Wales, another used a phrase that translates as, "Between womb and world, I call the saints." Again and again, the theme is clear. Invocation, not command, not power, but calling quietly into the unknown. By the 15th century, church officials began to issue manuals, specifically for midwives. The most famous of these was Der Rosengarten, or the Rose Garden, printed in Germany in the early 1500s. It tried to regulate their practices, to instruct them on when to call the priest, how to perform emergency baptisms, in which words were allowed. But even these manuals acknowledged reality. They knew the church could not be everywhere, and so, begrudgingly, they made room for whispered prayers, room for necessary speech, room for women who were not authorized, but were present. Marjorie Clay may never have read a manual, but she lived this reality. She operated on the edge, not of law, but of practice. She was tolerated until she wasn't, allowed until she wasn't, and then she vanished. Perhaps she stopped speaking, or perhaps she simply spoke more quietly. Either way, her kind endured, because women kept being born. Babies kept arriving too early, too late, too small, and someone had to be there. Someone had to hold the child, to say the words, to welcome life into a world full of pain and breath and sacred rules written by men far away. It is easy now to look back and wonder, why didn't these women fight? Why didn't they argue theology? Why didn't they write defenses of their words? But they were too busy saving lives. And in the quiet moments between crisis and death, they knew what mattered. Not dogma, not rank, but breath and blessing. So they kept speaking, even when the records tried to silence them, even when the bishops frowned, even when the pages forgot. And maybe, just maybe, that's why we still remember, not their names, not their doctrines, but their voices. Because even now, in lullabies and folk songs, in the half-remembered prayers of great-grandmothers, their whispers remain, and the question lingers, what does it mean to speak holiness aloud when the world tells you not to, not to? By the time Marjorie Clay's name disappeared from the civic records of Norwich in the 1340s, the broader world she inhabited was beginning to change, not in grand, obvious ways, but in the quiet, shifting habits of how people related to power, to language, and to care. The church remained dominant, its cathedrals rising above every village square, its doctrines inscribed into law. But on the margins, in spaces not built of stone or sanctioned in Latin, other forms of memory lingered. Women's voices, barely audible, kept breathing life into the spaces between rules, and nowhere were these voices more persistent than childbirth. Let us take a closer look at what came after Marjorie, after Greta, after the other midwives, whose whispered words once drew the cautious attention of bishops. What became of the women who prayed aloud, and those who came to rely on them? By the mid-15th century, formal church policy on midwifery began to solidify in new ways. In some dioceses, particularly in Germany and parts of France, midwives were now required to take oaths. These oaths varied in content, but most included promises such as not to baptize children unless absolutely necessary, not to speak sacred words unless taught by the priest, not to perform rites reserved for clergy, and in some versions, not to speak aloud in the presence of the devil or to use chants of unknown origin. The irony was that these oaths institutionalized something the church had long tried to ignore, that women were praying, had always been praying, and now had to be regulated more openly in Nuremberg. For instance, an official oath from 1491 includes the line, "I shall," Use no Latin unless instructed. I shall not pretend to call angels or saints. Shall not name Mary aloud in any supplication. K. The phrasing here is cautious, legalistic. It attempts to draw a firm line between allowed and forbidden speech, not to stop women from speaking, but to define how they should sound if they did. But language is a slippery thing. The more the church tried to contain it, the more it spilled sideways into rhymes, into melodies, into the hum of a woman pressing cloth against a brow. And so, while the official midwifery oath traveled through courts and chanceries, something else passed down hand to hand. Notebooks, herbal manuscripts, fragments of folk prayers scrawled on scraps of vellum. In one such scrap, recovered from a 15th century house in Bruges, the short line reads, "Speak not loud, but speak sure. The name of Mary shields the door." Another, found in the binding of a recipe book in York, says, "Breathe slow, say low, Christ between, Christ below." These weren't part of any sanctioned liturgy. 2. They weren't theological statements, but they held meaning, and perhaps in their own way. They were more enduring than the official rules, because the women who whispered them weren't writing for scholars or bishops, They were writing for each other. It is here, in this tangled, ordinary space between survival and speech, that Marjorie Clay's legacy becomes clear, not because she was exceptional, but because she was typical. She prayed aloud. She was warned. She prayed again, and then, likely, she continued more quietly, more carefully, and with the knowledge that other women were doing the same. We don't know if she trained an apprentice, but midwifery was often taught through demonstration. A younger woman would shadow an elder, observing the rhythm of work and voice. What mattered wasn't just what was done, but how it was done, the tone of reassurance, the cadence of breath, the exact moment to whisper a blessing. And so, even as official doctrine hardened, the culture of whispered faith continued, in ways too small, too mundane, too necessary to suppress. We can find traces of this endurance in unexpected places. Take, for example, the 1522 manual Der Schwangeren Trust Comfort for pregnant women, printed in German for lay readers, ostensibly a guide to moral conduct during pregnancy. It includes a small section titled Words to Say When the Labor Grows Long. In it are phrases like, "May your pain be less than Eve's. May your child know light. May God's eye be upon your brow." The author, likely a male cleric, presents these words as acceptable, even beneficial. But the wording suggests oral tradition. These are not liturgical fragments. They are field prayers, functional, emotional, intimate. It is unlikely a man invented them. More likely, recorded what women had already been saying for centuries, and by doing so, accidentally preserved a legacy of midwives like Marjorie. These legacies are fragile. They are not built of doctrine, but of gesture, of hushed phrases passed on during contractions, of prayers not written to last, but to help. And yet, spite, or perhaps because of their ephemeral nature, some echoes take the form of lullabies in certain regions of Ireland. Traditional cradle songs include phrases like, "Saint Bridget, bless this cradle and the breath that fills it. Holy Mary at the foot, Holy Jesus at the head. Keep this child from pain and dread." Such songs are not liturgical. They are domestic, personal, but the structure, the invocation, the protective imagery is precisely what midwives once whispered over struggling infants, and in this way, their voices remain. Let us pause here and consider a more modern observation. In 1931, folklorist named Elsie Clews Parsons interviewed a group of elderly women in rural Norfolk, not far from where Marjorie Clay once lived. When asked if they remembered any old birthing customs, one woman said, "My mother always said, if you had a hard labor, Dad, the midwife would hum a song, but not one from the Bible. It was just A psalm she knew. Another woman added. They had words for babies who came too soon. Quiet words, never told to men. This was nearly 600 years after Marjorie, but the pattern had not vanished. It had simply gone underground, sustained by women, for women. And that raises a final, quiet question. Was the church's fear of women speaking blessings, unauthorized voices, shaping sacred moments, perhaps a sign that they sensed something enduring, something uncontainable? Because when life begins in pain and mystery, the need for comfort is ancient, and when institutions fail to arrive in time, ordinary people fill the gap. So the midwife speaks, not as a priest, not as a rebel, but as a witness. She sees the first breath, the wet skin, the trembling hands of the mother, and in that moment, she speaks, not loudly, not grandly, but with enough certainty to steady the room. Christ keep you, or breathe, little one, or simply let the saints be near. And in that moment, history tilts, not with drama, not with fanfare, but with the quiet power of someone doing what must be done. Someone like Marjorie Clay, someone whose voice lingers, even if her name is mostly forgotten. And so we ask, how many other voices have we lost? Not because they were unworthy, but because they were never allowed to be written down. And what prayers still remain, waiting like embers in the breath of someone not yet heard. The stars never cared who watched them. They burned and shimmered for thousands of years before anyone gave them names, and they would continue long after. But in a quiet convent tucked away in the hills of Lombardy in the early 14th century, a woman named Sister Caterina watched them more closely than she was allowed, and she began to write. This story begins not with drama, but with order, scriptorium, a walled garden, the slow scraping of ink across parchment. It begins with a convent routine, prayers at matins, silence during labor, chants at vespers, every hour marked by the toll of bells. Time segmented and sacred. But Caterina did not always trust the bells, because sometimes the stars said something different. Born around 1290 to a family of minor merchants, Caterina had not expected a cloistered life. As a girl, she'd sat beside her uncle's spice scales, tallying weights in coin, learning ratios and lunar calendars used by traders sailing from Genoa to Byzantium. Her mother taught her letters. Her father taught her tides. But in 1302, a plague swept through Brescia. Her parents died. Her uncle remarried, and Caterina, now 12 and inconvenient, was placed at the convent of Santa Lucia, where girls with no dowries and too many questions often ended up. The convent was not cruel. It had gardens, books, even some gentler nuns who allowed her to read. More than her share of scripture, she learned Latin quickly. She sang well. She kept her hands busy with sewing and illumination. But what Caterina wanted, what she really wanted, was the sky. It began with something small, a discrepancy. Each month, the calendar posted in the convent refectory would note the date of the new moon. But Caterina noticed that it didn't always match what she could see through her window at night. Sometimes the crescent returned a day earlier, sometimes a day late. She mentioned it once, offhandedly, to the convent's prioress. The older woman frowned and told her not to dwell on celestial matters. The stars, she said, were the domain of God and men, not nuns, not girls. But Caterina kept watching. The convent had a small library, mostly theological texts, but tucked away in the margins of a borrowed missal was a set of copied diagrams, crude planetary charts, cliquely traced by a curious novice long before Caterina's arrival. They weren't accurate, but they were fascinating. From these, and from fragments of treatises brought in by visiting friars, Caterina began to learn the basics of medieval cosmology, the Ptolemaic system, with Earth at the center, surrounded by crystal spheres bearing the moon, sun, planets, and stars. She read about epicycles and conjunctions. She learned, slowly, to make her own observations. Of course, she had no instruments, no astrolabe, no quadrant. What she had was parchment, a stylus, and a tiny east-facing window with an iron lattice dot, and so she watched, night after night. She traced the paths of the moon and the wandering stars. She noticed how Mars turned retrograde, how Venus rose before dawn in certain seasons, how the shadows of the moon waxed differently depending on its angle in the sky. She wrote nothing directly, not at first, only small sketches, disguised as decorative margins. A curve here, a dot there, rising line woven into the stem of a vine, a tiny planetary glyph hidden inside a flower. The church, officially, did not oppose the study of astronomy. It was taught at universities, after all. But women, especially cloistered women, were not expected to ponder the movements of celestial bodies. Their role was to obey, not to observe. Still, Caterina persisted. In 1310, a new novice arrived, Lucia della Torre, the daughter of a minor nobleman, bright, restless, and more outspoken than was wise. She noticed Caterina's drawings almost immediately. One evening during sewing hour, she whispered, "That's not a rose. That's the path of Jupiter." Caterina didn't deny it. The two became close, not scandalously so. Their bond was rooted in knowledge, not forbidden touch, but in the tight corridors of convent life. Even intellectual intimacy could be viewed with suspicion. Lucia had studied more than most girls her age. She knew the basics of Galenic medicine and had seen an astrolabe once in Padua. She asked Caterina careful questions, suggested a better way to map declinations using a wax tablet and a threaded bead. They began to meet quietly at night, comparing notes, tracking stars through the grating in their respective cells. For almost 2 years. This hidden study continued. They calculated lunar phases. They mapped eclipses. They estimated solstices based not on the church calendar, but on real observation. And then, in 1312, they made a mistake. Caterina, eager to test their calculations, prepared a short tract predicting a lunar eclipse. She phrased it carefully, calling it a heavenly shadowing, and framing it as a devotional meditation. But the tract circulated more widely than she'd intended. A visiting Franciscan friar saw it. He was not amused. 2 weeks later, the Bishop of Brescia sent an inquisitor to the convent. There was no trial, no formal accusation of heresy. But Caterina was summoned to speak with the prioress and the inquisitor privately. We have no transcript of what was said. Only a note in the convent's ledger that reads, "Sister Caterina has been advised to surrender all unsanctioned writings and refrain from further contemplation of the heavens. She shall be relocated to the infirmary wing for quieter duties." Lucia was reassigned as well to the convent kitchens. Their notebooks vanished. Their diagrams were scraped clean from the vellum, but some traces remain in a manuscript preserved in the Biblioteca Ambrosiana in Milan. There is a book of ours from the early 14th century with unusually elaborate marginalia along the edges. Of the April calendar page are a series of tiny, consistent dots arranged not in floral patterns, but in spirals and loops that match the orbital paths of visible planets. Someone, in quiet rebellion, etched the stars into sacred time. Was it Caterina, a sympathetic scribe, a novice who learned from them? Cannot know, but the symbols matched those found in other anonymous manuscripts from the region, it seems. Caterina's work endured, not because it was accepted, but because it was noticed, and that, perhaps, is the quiet miracle of this story. In a world that expected her to be still, Caterina watched. In a church that taught her to listen, she asked. And in a sky that told no lies, she found patterns no doctrine could deny. Her questions were not grand. She did not propose heliocentrism. She did not publish a theory. She did not reform theology. What she did was simple. She asked, why does the moon sometimes rise early? K. Why does Venus glow more brightly in winter? Why do the bells not always match the stars? K. And then she tried to answer with ink, with patience, with forbidden attention. In doing so, she joined a lineage of women who observed in secret, who calculated in the margins, who recorded the heavens not for glory, but for understanding. And so we ask, how many consolations were first traced, not in ivory towers, but in the flickering shadows of a convent cell? And what is remembered or erased when knowledge is bound to silence, to silence? The infirmary of the convent of Santa Lucia was not a place of punishment. It was a place of service. Cool stone walls, clean linens, broth that simmered gently at dawn. Sick nuns were tended to with gentle hands and whispered prayers. The infirmary required attentiveness, quiet strength, the ability to sit still and notice what was not said, a subtle wheeze in the breath, the pale tint beneath a fingernail, the fevered mutterings that came at midnight. For most, this reassignment would have marked an end, but for Sister Caterina, it became a beginning. She did not speak of the eclipse predictions again, nor did she ask questions about retrograde motion or celestial epicycles. She folded her astronomy into silence, like linen into a drawer, but she never stopped observing. The infirmary, as it turned out, had its own windows. Not the lattice-caged ones of the dormitory cells, but broader arches set higher in the wall, meant for light and airflow. And through them, Caterina could see the western sky, a new angle. She began to notice things she hadn't tracked before. The timing of sunsets across the seasons, the shifting position of Orion in the winter sky, the way certain stars disappeared just before dawn, swallowed by the light, not because they moved, but because the earth turned. She began to suspect something. It was not a rebellion. It's not an accusation, but a quiet awareness that the Ptolemaic model, with all its elegant spheres, did not quite fit what her eyes reported. But such thoughts remained unspoken, always unspoken. Instead, she turned to a safer subject, timekeeping. Unlike astronomy, timekeeping had practical uses for a nun. It was a part of the rule, when to rise, when to pray, when to labor. And as Caterina tended to the sick, she realized that the bells did not always align with the body. Fevers broke at odd hours. Sleep came in waves. A dying breath paid no attention to lauds or prime. So she began to track time another way, not by bells, but by light. She marked the shadows cast by a thin rod near the window at different hours of the day. She noted how the length changed through the seasons. She watched how the angle of morning sun shifted ever so slightly along the edge, the infirmary wall. These observations had nothing to do with rebellion. They were practical. When she knew how the light moved, she could better anticipate a chill in the room. She could adjust the blankets before dawn. She could bring cool water before a fever spiked. But still, she kept notes, not in bound books. Those were now beyond her reach. Instead, she wrote in her mind, committing angles, rhythms, and changes to memory. And when she needed to make marks, she did so in the margins of the linen inventory. Small dots, coded lines, always deniable. Meanwhile, Sister Lucia, reassigned to the kitchens, was learning her own silent geometry. She learned how the moon influenced the rising of bread, how certain herbs kept better when harvested under a waning crescent, how milk soured faster under full moons. She began to keep a food calendar, ostensibly to track spoilage, but it mirrored the lunar cycle precisely. The two women rarely spoke directly, but in the shared silence of labor, in the exchange of a folded napkin or a pail of water, there was understanding. Their observations had become unrecorded science, boring, practical, unnoticed, and yet, these quiet acts were dangerous in a world where knowledge was supposed to flow only downward, from bishops to priest to the faithful, not laterally from woman to woman, and certainly not upward from experience to theory. But Caterina's observations were not theory. They were lived in 1315. A great famine swept across Lombardy. It followed 3 years of poor harvests, too much rain, and an early frost that killed the vines. The convent survived barely, but many of the sisters grew weak. The infirmary was full, and it was during this time that Caterina began to write again, not for herself, but for Sister Imelda, a novice who fell ill with a wasting fever. Imelda was bright, only 17, and deeply afraid of dying. One night, she asked Caterina what stars looked like. She had never seen the sky clearly. Her cell faced the inner courtyard, so Caterina described them, slowly, softly, one by one. She told Imelda how Sirius flashed in winter, how the Pleiades clustered like distant birds, how Venus lit the horizon before dawn, like a lantern left burning. She described the moon's phases in patient detail, not to impress, but to comfort. Imelda asked her to write it down. Caterina hesitated, but then she remembered. No one was reading the old medical parchments anymore, not during the famine, not when the sick outnumbered the healthy. So she took an unused folio, originally a commentary on Galen, and began to copy her thoughts, into the margins. They were not scientific diagrams, not celestial charts. They were small devotions, descriptions of what stars did when the world felt dark. She called it the quiet movements of God. It was not theology. It was not astronomy. It was simply the truth of what she had seen, and it spread. Other nuns, nursing the dying or enduring sleepless nights, began to pass the folio around. They added their own notes, a comment about the wind from the west, a line of verse about Polaris, a prayer for light. No one called it rebellion, but it was, because it told the truth, not the grand doctrinal truth of councils and creeds, but the personal, dull, tender truth of women who had watched the sky and lived through silence, and that truth could not be UNLEARNE. Years later. Long after the famine passed and Caterina's hair turned silver, a new abbess arrived at Santa Lucia. She was young, educated, and full of reforming zeal. She found the folio, now tattered and thick with annotations, and asked who had written it. No one answered, because by then it belonged to everyone. And perhaps that is how Caterina's knowledge survived, not by attribution, but by diffusion, not as doctrine, but as common sense. It traveled as wisdom often does, quietly, slowly, folded into ritual by the 1350s. Long after Caterina's death, the convent began marking the equinox with a small ceremony, lighting candles at dawn, and reading verses that included the line, "The stars do not argue, no they appear." There is no record of who wrote that line, but those who read it knew what it meant. And so we return to the larger question: what happens when forbidden knowledge is not suppressed, but absorbed, not lost, but translated into something useful? Caterina never left the convent. She never published. She never spoke before council, but she looked up, and when she did, she saw that truth was not owned by any one authority, that patterns, once noticed, cannot be unseen. That knowledge, whispered in silence, can echo louder than shouts. So we ask again, how many forgotten women traced the stars, not for power, but for peace? And how many truths began not in books, but in the eyes of someone who simply paid attention? The old convent bells rang out in slow, hollow tones across the fields of Lombardy. The sound was familiar, too familiar, but Sister Caterina, now in her later years, no longer relied on them as she once did. For half a century, she had heard them toll the hours, announce deaths, summon prayer. But it was the silence between the bells that had come to define her, the silence of careful study, of thoughts never spoken aloud, of the stars whispering too. those who look for patterns, not authority. By the 1340s, Caterina had become a fixture in the infirmary, not because she was infirm, but because she had made it hers. Though her back now curved and her hands stiffened with age, the other nuns still brought her patience, questions, and in secret observations. The younger sister might describe a halo around the moon. Another might quietly wonder about why her herbs grew differently during certain weeks of the month. A novice might offer a poem that described a meteor streak as a divine sign. They didn't call it astronomy. They called it watching. Tac Rene had once written, in the margins of a psalter, the sky does not ask for belief. It merely continues. She believed that. She had lived by it, and now, in her last years, others were beginning to understand it, too. One of them was Sister Margarita, a pale, thoughtful novice with a sharp mind and a steadier hand than Caterina's had ever been. It was Margarita who, with trembling reverence, rescued the old vellum folio that the reformist abbess had threatened to burn. It was Margarita who recopied its contents into new parchment, updating the script, translating the most obscure terms, and gently framing Caterina's once hidden notes as natural contemplations in the Benedictine tradition. It was not false, it was clever, because in this rewording, this quiet reframing, the knowledge survived, and Caterina, ever detached, ever quiet, approved. She didn't need credit. She didn't want it. She only wanted the sky to be noticed. But change was coming. Not from Caterina, not from the nuns, but from far beyond their cloistered walls. The year was 1347. A Venetian ship arrived at Messina with rats on board. Within months, the Black Death had swept through the Italian peninsula, and the convent of Santa Lucia, once spared in the famine of 1315, found itself helpless against the creeping illness. Nuns fell sick. Sister Lucia, Caterina's companion from long ago, died quietly in her cell, her hands clasped around a prayer roll that had long faded. Margarita fell ill too, but survived, and through it all, Caterina remained strangely untouched. She nursed the sick, washed their linens, boiled rosemary and myrrh to mask the stench of death. And at night, she returned to the window in the infirmary, where the stars, unbothered, distant, continued their rhythm. One night, she said softly to Margarita, "They do not care for us. That is why they comfort us." It was not despair, it was perspective. In the summer of 1351, after a long, fevered August, Sister Caterina lay down for the final time. There was no official record of her death beyond a single line in the convent register. Sister Caterina of Brescia, aged 61, departed quietly in the night. No mention of her diagrams, her lunar calendars, her decades of observation or subtle rebellion, but her influence did not die with her. Years later, during the early 15th century, a traveling scholar from Padua visited the convent to examine its illuminated manuscripts. Among the standard devotional texts, he found a curious volume labeled Calendarium Domini Celestis, the calendar of the Heavenly Lady. It contained seasonal charts, solstice predictions, and an elegantly rendered diagram of the procession of the stars, presented in soft tones of blue and ochre. No author was listed, but in the bottom right corner of the winter page was a tiny symbol, a crescent moon within a circle. The same symbol Caterina once etched into her herb records. The scholar copied its contents and brought it to his university. From there, fragments of it entered wider circulation, often unattributed. A phrase here, a diagram there, but its bones remained intact. It is possible, though not confirmed, that some of the anonymous observations cited by later Renaissance astronomers had their roots in this hidden work. That ideas passed from hand to hand, cloister to cloister, until they reached those whose names would be remembered. But Caterina's name would not be, because she never wrote under it, because the Church, at the time, would not have permitted it, because her knowledge was not collected to be remembered. It was collected to be used. And yet, her story lingers like moonlight on stone. Subtle, cold, persistent. In 1994, a scholar of medieval science named Anna Cattaneo published an article examining marginal astronomical diagrams in convent manuscripts across northern Italy. In it, she noted that a surprising number of these diagrams, though stylistically diverse, used the same glyphs and followed a remarkably consistent observational pattern. She proposed, cautiously, that these could be the result of a single observational tradition, not academic, not clerical, but monastic-female. She called it the Silent Sky Network. Today, few speak of it, but the manuscripts remain hidden in bindings, scribbled in margins, written in the language of caution, service, and slow resistance. And perhaps that is the most remarkable thing of all, that in an age where women were told not to look upward, some did, that in a church where questioning the heavens was dangerous, some asked anyway, that in a world where knowledge was meant to flow only through sanctioned paths, some found cracks and flowed around them. So we end this story not with closure, but with wonder. How many stars have been named, and how many have simply been noticed? How much of what we know today was first whispered in the darkness, not by scholars or priests, but by women who were never meant to speak? And what else still lies waiting in the margins, quiet, patient, watching the sky? Rome in the 9th century was a city of contradiction. It glittered with relics and ruins, saints and senators, marble and mud. The scent of incense wafted past butcher stalls. Peasant children played among broken aqueducts, and within the Lateran palace, spiritual power tangled with earthly intrigue. Popes were crowned, exiled, poisoned, replaced. It was not a quiet age for the church, nor was it kind to women, unless they served in silence. This was the world that shaped the legend of Pope Joan. But we will not begin with her, not directly. Instead, we begin with a woman named Theodora. Not the empress, not the saint. This Theodora was a Roman matron, born into a family of minor bureaucrats. She had no crown, no monastery, no official title. But she had something far rarer: access. Her brother was a subdeacon. Her cousin worked in the papal archives. Her late husband had been a notary. Through them, and through her own careful navigation of custom and charity, Theodora became known as something unusual: a midwife who was welcome in clerical circles. Most midwives served the poor. They handled births in tenement courtyards, in the back rooms of taverns, beside wells and cradles of straw. Theodora, however, had delivered the niece of a cardinal. She had tended to the wife of a wealthy Roman judge. She understood discretion and was trusted for it. And so, when a scandal threatened to erupt quietly within the Lateran complex one spring morning in the year 857, it was Theodora who was summoned, not for a birth, but for a warning. A cardinal's servant met her in the alley behind the basilica. No formal greeting, no explanations, just 2 words: "Come now." She followed him through the rear halls, past mosaics of golden apostles and frescoes of paradise. It was a world she had seen before, but only at the edges. Now she was ushered into a side chamber where 2 men stood pacing nervously, and a third lay on a cot, clutching his abdomen. Except he wasn't a man, not fully, and the pain was not illness, it was labor. Theodora recognized it immediately: the sharp inhale, the tightness in the face, the sweat at the hairline. She had seen it 100 times in courtyards and kitchens, but never here, never like this. She asked no questions. She simply stepped forward and began her work. It was a difficult birth. The body had been bound for too long, ribs compressed, hips restricted, nourishment poor. The child came breech. Theodora, whispering soft prayers, turned it gently inside the womb. It took hours. When the infant finally emerged, a pale, squalling girl, there was no joy, no applause, no candle lit in thanksgiving, just silence. Theodora cleaned the child, swaddled her, and placed her in the arms of a veiled attendant, whose name she was not given. The person on the cot, the figure once known as Brother Johannes, leapt silently into a blood-stained cloth. Theodora left with no payment, only the quiet understanding that what she had witnessed would never be spoken of, but she did not forget. Years passed. Theodora continued her work, though more cautiously. Rome had grown suspicious of women who lingered near power. The death of Pope Leo IV had triggered another wave of ecclesiastical maneuvering. Nobles competed to place relatives on the throne of St. Peter. Factions aligned and dissolved, and then, suddenly, in 855, or perhaps 856, a new pope emerged. He called himself Johannes Anglicus, a scholar, they said, a reformer, quiet and mysterious. Little was known of his early life, though rumors whispered of Athens, or Mainz, or even England. He spoke Greek fluently. He avoided ceremonial excess. He listened more than he preached, and he surrounded himself with a curiously small inner circle. Theodora saw him once, or thought she did. It was during a public procession for the feast of Saints Peter and Paul. The sun beat down on the cobbled streets. Crowds pressed forward to see the white-robed figure pass. Theodora, now in her 50s, stood on a corner near the old fish market. The PayPal litter passed slowly, and for the briefest moment, the figure within turned her way. Their eyes met, and she knew, not because of scandal, or memory, or recognition, but because no man, not even the most restrained cleric, had ever looked at her with that mixture of fear, gratitude, and warning. It was her again, the mother, Scala, Spanish patient from the Lateran cat, now dressed in gold-threaded vestments, now holding the staff of the Vicar of Christ. Now Pope Theodora did not tell anyone. She did not need to, because soon the city began to whisper. They did not name the truth, not directly, but the signs were there. Refusal to lead mass when bleeding, a reluctance to visit bathing houses, the absence of palace concubines, which was notable only because it broke tradition. And then there were the scrolls under Pope Johannes. A quiet revision began in the scriptoriums. Old texts were recopied, margins were redacted, female saints were emphasized less. Canon law was reinforced around chastity and silence. It was as though someone, afraid of their own reflection, was trying to disappear all echoes of women from the church. Theodora recognized the pattern. It was the same fear she had seen in new mothers who had lost daughters. A grief expressed not in mourning, but in erasure. In the 3rd year of Johan's reign, curious request reached Theodora. It came not from the palace, but from a nun in a distant Benedictine abbey near Ravenna. The note was coded, written in liturgical phrasing, but the message was clear. They needed help with the birth, and the child, they suspected, was born of someone too high to admit it. Theodora refused. At first, she was too old, the journey too far, but something in the handwriting tugged at her. It matched the letters she had once delivered to the Lateran archives for Brother Johannes. She traveled under a false name. The abbey was quiet, built into a hillside. The birth had already occurred when she arrived, a healthy boy delivered safely, but now hidden. The mother, unnamed, had vanished. The nuns only offered one detail. The child had been baptized in absentia by a traveling cleric who had wept. The entire time, Theodora returned to Rome with more questions than answers, but she said nothing, because by then the end had begun. One spring morning in 858, or possibly 859, Pope Johannes collapsed during a public procession. Some said it was a stroke, others claimed poisoning, but those nearest the scene whispered something stranger, that as the Pope fell, something else fell to a birthing stone from beneath the litter. meant to symbolize divine fertility. That the Pope, writhing in pain, had miscarried. That a child's body was found beneath the hem of the vestments. It was never proven, because within days all accounts were sealed, and within weeks a new pope was named Benedict III. Johannes was buried quickly. No formal canonization, no effigies, no papal coins bearing their face, only silence. And Theodora, now nearly 60, faded into obscurity along with her memory. But history is not always so easily erased. In the 13th century, a statue was erected in Rome of a pope seated among earlier pontiffs with no name beneath. Locals called it Papessa Giovanna, Pope Joan. Church officials denied its meaning, but travelers wrote it down. In the 15th century, German chroniclers began including her in papal lists, then striking her out. English playwrights staged her story. French encyclopedists debated her name, and always the same question lingered. Could a woman really have sat on the papal throne? As we close this first section, we must ask what matters more, truth or memory? Was there truly a Pope Joan? Or was there only a midwife, a mother, a scholar, and a silence too vast to trace? And if no records remain, but the fear remains, what does that say about the story? Not that it was impossible, but that it was inconvenient. And so we must wonder, what else did the sky see that never made it into the scrolls? For centuries, calmed, the Vatican archives have been a paradox, a fortress of knowledge and a chamber of forgetting. Inside its stone corridors and locked chambers lie not only papal bulls and edicts, but birth records, letters, reports of visions, accusations of heresy, and the most delicate documents, the ones marked only with sigils, without names. Among those scrolls are gaps, empty entries, years where the papal succession runs smooth on the surface, and then jerks violently into correction. These are the scars left, not by war or plague, but by memory, deliberately unwound. In one such file from the 9th century, an archivist in the 1600s made a note. Some speak of a certain Johannes Anglicus, placed between Leo and Benedict. No confirmation. Possibly apocryphal. The phrase possibly apocryphal is a wound disguised as a bandage, because many of the clerics and scribes who repeated it weren't doubting the existence of such a pope. They were protecting themselves from the weight of truth. In the decades after Johannes Anglicus, several strange shifts occurred in church tradition, too subtle to be considered a purge, but oddly consistent. First came the formalization of the sedia stercoraria, a peculiar ritual seat with a hole in the center, through which the genitals of a new pope could be ceremonially verified. The origins of the ritual were unclear, and the church later claimed it was symbolic, but its emergence, just after the alleged reign of Pope Joan, raised quiet eyebrows. Second came a proliferation of hagiographies that emphasized male chastity, clerical masculinity, and female error. Saints like Eugenius of Toledo, known for converting heretical women, gained renewed popularity. Miracles involving male authority triumphing over feminine deception increased in frequency, not in actual occurrence, but in transcription. Third, and perhaps most revealing, was the strange silence that fell over certain years in regional bishopric records. Letters from Frankish monasteries that previously showed regular communication with Rome suddenly skipped years, only to resume under Pope Benedict III, as if nothing had occurred. These absences do not scream, they murmur, and for Theodora, long retired, now living among the Benedictine sisters outside Spoleto, these murmurs had become the music of her final years. She had outlived almost everyone from her time in Rome. The cardinal whose niece she delivered had died in exile. The cousin in the papal archives had vanished after a clerical misfiling scandal. And even the midwife who once whispered to her about the strange bloodied robe recovered near the Basilica of San Clemente. She had taken vows of silence, but Theodora remembered, not in bitterness, not in anger, in diligence. She had begun a quiet record of her own, not a memoir that would have been dangerous, but a collection of stories about women who moved through the church like water, always adjusting, always present, never held. One of the first entries described a woman clothed as a priest, called to hear the confessions of nuns in disguise, later vanished. Another told of a female illuminator who slipped likenesses of women into the depictions of the apostles, subtly, quietly, and was eventually sent to a rural convent for moral correction. In the center of the folio, on a page without heading, was a single drawing, a papal tiara resting beside a cradle. No explanation, just the image, because Theodora understood what many did not, that the most dangerous stories are not the ones loudly denied, but the ones quietly erased. Meanwhile, outside the convent walls, a legend grew by the 11th century. Pilgrims in Rome had begun sharing a tale of a female pope who had given birth during a procession and was stoned to death by an angry mob. The church, they said, had tried to hide it, but the cobblestones still bore her name, hidden beneath centuries of dirt. By the 13th century, the Dominican chronicler Jean de Mailly gave her a name, Johanna. He claimed she reigned for 2 years, 7 months, and 4 days. He added details: a secret education in Athens, a lover who assisted her deception, and a fatal moment of exposure during the Feast of the Virgin. None of it could be proven. All of it spread. Some accounts painted her as a symbol of feminine ambition gone too far. Others treated her as a cautionary tale, a punishment for Rome's pride. But in every telling, one thing remained consistent. She had not been permitted to simply exist. She had to be a fable, warning, or a sin. Never a person in the monastery. Archives at Monte Cassino. A 14th century monk named Pietro compiled a curious collection titled De Mirabilibus Temporis, of the marvels of the time. Most of the manuscript was standard, tales of saints, meteorological signs, omens of comets, but one entry stands out. It reads, "In the reign of the Pope, who was neither named nor numbered, a midwife of the Aventine witnessed a crown pass from hand to hand, and no one dared to ask whose head had worn it." The reference is obscure, but the phrasing, neither named nor numbered, matches exactly with what a 17th century Jesuit librarian would later write about the missing PayPal line. There's a gap where one number ought to be. It is not a mistake. It is obedience. And so the silence continued as Theodora approached her final days. She passed her folio to a young sister named Paula, a quiet novice, who had once cared for her when her joint swelled and the pain became sharp. Paola asked her once, softly, "Were the stories true?" Theodora replied, "The ones with no names are truest." After Theodora's death, her notes were hidden, not destroyed. It's buried among ordinary herbals and liturgical calendars. Sister Paula copied parts of them into decorative scrolls, bedding subtle symbols into vines and capitals. One scroll reached a scriptorium in Reims. Another, decades later, was read aloud in part to a girl named Marguerite, who would go on to write her own tale of La Papesse. Stories ripple, even when names are taken in the 19th century. When scholars began combing through the Vatican archives more aggressively, they found no direct evidence of a Pope Joan, but they did find the gaps, the altered succession lists, the double entries, the PayPal chairs with suspicious provenance, and the portraits of popes in mosaics that had once shown one face, but were later plastered over the outlines still visible beneath the newer paint. And then there was the statue, the one in Siena, labeled simply Johanna 8. No explanation, just a name. When questioned, local priests denied it had ever existed. It was quietly removed, but photographs taken before its removal now circulate in dusty academic journals. In the British Library, A marginal note by a medieval traveler reads, "In Rome, one hears stories the priests deny, and the stones remember." So now, centuries later, the question returns, was there a female pope? Did Theodora, the midwife of the Aventine, deliver the child of a pontiff in secret? Or were these only stories mirrors held up to the church by those who could never enter it? We may never know, because what survives in the archives is only part of the truth. The rest lives in the margins, in the stories passed from sister to novice, in the whispered names never entered into canon, in the gaps between popes where something still lingers. Not a scandal, not a miracle, but a woman who dared to learn, to lead, and to disappear. Disappear in the shadowy quiet of church history, where incense is faded and the saints are chipped from centuries of touch. There remain certain absences that feel heavier than presence. Joan, if that was her name, never left behind a decree, number. Epistles bear her seal. No homilies written in her hand. Not even a surviving robe or ring remains in a reliquary. In fact, the great miracle of her story is not that she ruled, but that she vanished, erased, scrubbed, not by accident, but by policy. But what does it mean to be erased? Is it to be forgotten, be unloved, or is it to be remembered only through contradiction, as myth, as scandal, as a mistake? That is how the church treated her, and that is how later scholars tried to recover her, like rescuing ink from water. Yet, a name suppressed often becomes more powerful than one celebrated, and, in time, that very suppression gave rise to something the erasure could never contain: memory without permission. By the 16th century, the tale of Pope Joan had stretched far beyond Italy. In England, Protestant pamphleteers used her story as proof of papal corruption, arguing that if a woman could infiltrate the chair of St. Peter, then surely the whole hierarchy was built on deceit. In Germany, the Reformation gave fresh voice to her legend, casting her not as a criminal, but as a courageous martyr. A woman of learning in a time of repression. Martin Luther never mentioned her directly, but some of his followers did, wondering aloud if perhaps it was Joan who revealed, through her secret reign, the deep fallibility of Roman tradition. Even in France, where skepticism had grown fashionable, cyclopedists in the 18th century debated her reality with great seriousness. Diderot's encyclopedia called her existence doubtful, but included her anyway. The French revolutionaries, who toppled kings and renamed cathedrals, admired her for what she represented: the possibility of interruption in systems built on unbroken power. But not all remembered her fondly. Within the Vatican, quiet efforts intensified to remove her from the margins of official chronologies. New editions of papal lists simply skipped the name Johannes Anglicus altogether, or insisted he had been a misidentified cardinal. Some even claimed the entire episode was based on a misunderstood carnival play, a joke that grew into a rumor, that grew into a heresy, and yet the public would not let her go. In the streets of Rome, pilgrims still whispered her name when they passed certain fountains. A narrow alley near the old Via Sacra was called La Strada della Papessa, the street of the Lady Pope. Well into the 19th century, before being renamed in a flurry of urban modernization, even the sedia statuaria, the strange ritual chair with a verifying hole, continued to appear in coronation ceremonies into the Renaissance. No longer explained, no longer necessary, just performed out of habit, or superstition, or memory. But among all the places where her shadow lingered, none held it more intimately than the Benedictine convents of central Italy. It was here, in stone cloisters above olive groves and mountain valleys, that the memory of Theodora the midwife also lingered. Sister Paula, the novice who inherited Theodora's notes, eventually became abbess. She never published the stories. She never claimed they were histories, but she embedded them, line by line, into the convent's lectionaries, placing subtle feminine pronouns in readings where none had been before. She had icons repainted, shifting the angle of a halo or softening the jaw of a disciple until it looked, just faintly, like a woman in disguise. She trained the young sisters not to ask whether the woman pope was real, but to ask why it mattered so much that she wasn't. And when inquisitors came, and they did, occasionally, especially in the 17th century, when the Counter-Reformation sought to seal every crack, they found no heresies, just prayer, just worn sandals, just the quiet discipline of women who knew how to speak without being heard. Paula died in obscurity, but her scrolls did not. One made its way to Florence, another to Avignon. A third was stored in the private library of a Swiss noblewoman who had taken temporary vows during a famine, and one, much later, would be found in the attic of an English country house by a visiting historian who thought it was a recipe book. It contained no dates, no popes, no names, just a drawing, a tiara beside a cradle. What should we do with such a legacy? A story that might not be true, but never stops being relevant. For many modern historians, the debate around Pope Joan has shifted from the question of whether she reigned to the more uncomfortable question of why we needed her too. Is it that we long to insert women into a narrative that has so often erased them? Is it a projection? Our desire to believe that somewhere, somehow, a woman broke through the most rigid hierarchy of medieval Europe? Or is it something older, something more primal? The need to believe that power, even in its most ancient and armored form, was not always what it claimed to be. Pope Joan, if she lived, was not simply a rebel or an impostor. She was a product of her time, a time that worshipped knowledge, but barred half its population from learning it. She would have studied in secret, memorized texts by lamplight, translated Greek, not for applause, but for survival. She would have worn the robes of a man not to mock the church, but because it was the only way she could enter the conversation, and she would have risen to the highest office not by trickery, but by merit, teaching, debating, advising, and ultimately persuading others that she was worthy, even if she never revealed why. And yet, even at the height of her influence, she would have lived with the constant weight of discovery that all it would take was one wrong breath, one moment of vulnerability, for the whole structure to collapse, for the church to recoil not from her theology, but from her biology. It is a cruel paradox that a woman who rose by wisdom would be remembered only for what her body did in public. Today, the Vatican maintains that Pope Joan never existed. They cite a lack of primary sources. 10. The inconsistencies in the stories. The fact that the legend didn't appear until centuries after the supposed reigned on, and all of that may be true, or it may be part of the erasure, because history is not written only in facts. It is written in omissions, in who gets named, in who gets numbered. In who gets buried under centuries of silence, so that others may reign without interruption. You walk now, slowly, through the streets of Rome. The sun has dipped behind the buildings. The tourists have gone. You pass the churches and fountains, the crumbling walls of forums, and the cold mouths of ancient wells. Somewhere nearby, beneath your feet, lies a stone that once marked a turning point. Not a monument, just a piece of road worn smooth by centuries of forgetting. And still, the wind might carry her name, not loud, but insistent, as if someone, long ago, said it aloud too many times for it to be fully erased. Joan, or Johans, or nothing at all. Only the question, only the space in the list, only the tiara beside the cradle, and the quiet certainty that someone was there even if we were never meant to know. Asterisk, good night, dot, 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 dot.